This is how much blood you have in your body. It's about 5 to 6 liters. And this is how much sugar or glucose you have in that blood. But now look what happens if I add just 1 more teaspoon of sugar. Do you see that? Well, I mean, it doesn't look like much, but now you have so much sugar or glucose in your blood that you're considered diabetic. And without proper treatment, your health would deteriorate and your life would be cut short. So 1 teaspoon of sugar is the difference between being healthy and being diabetic. And when you look at it from this perspective, it's kind of understandable why there are so many people fixated on keeping their blood glucose low and steady.
Everyone should use a CGM.
It allows you to track your blood sugar.
It's very hard to assess blood glucose without a continuous blood glucose
But if your
monitor.
glucose gets into a damaging range, it's actually going to cause problems in your body.
And when we get it just a little bit wrong, we go to hell in a handbasket.
But is that really so? Do we really need to worry about these tiny changes in the amount of sugar coursing through our veins? Or is this yet another fad aimed at health-focused individuals with deep pockets? I've now spent several months looking into this, using multiple different CGMs, and I've learned that we actually know very little about how healthy individuals might use these sensors and the data from these sensors, and that the marketing around CGMs is confusing at best and downright misleading at worst. And the thing is, if you don't understand the limitations of CGMs, trying to optimize your glucose might do more harm than good.
All that glucose in the starch is going to go straight to your bloodstream and create a big glucose spike.
Avoid glucose spikes, and they have no idea what they're talking about.
I don't know why everyone in the world isn't wearing it.
Before we jump into the video, I want to say thanks to today's sponsor, NordVPN. I regularly get emails notifying me that someone has logged into my Google account from a country across the world. And every time that happens, I have to go and change every single password on every site, which is exhausting. And this is exactly the kind of problem that NordVPN's threat protection is built to stop. It blocks malware, scam websites, trackers, and shady downloads before they can do harm. And NordVPN also has a password manager nowadays, so that you can just create a unique password for each and every site and never forget them. And if your data ever appears in a data breach, NordVPN also has a dark web monitoring tool that notifies you of it, so that you can act before someone else does. So if you want to upgrade your online safety, go to nordvpn.com/unlazyway or click the link in the description. You can try it out for 30 days for free, and if you get the 2-year plan, you also get 4 extra months for free. You know, don't wait for a breach to happen to take your online security seriously, because then it's too late. And now let's get back to the video. So first, to understand glucose monitors, we need to understand a little bit about human physiology. But I promise, it's just a little bit. Just a little bit. When you eat, some of the food that you eat is broken down into glucose. The glucose then enters your bloodstream, and your pancreas notices this. They secrete insulin, which urges your muscles to absorb and store the glucose, and this brings your blood glucose back down. Now, if you don't eat for a long time or you're fasting, your pancreas can increase your blood glucose by secreting glucagon, which encourages your liver to release some of the glucose it has stored. Using these 2 hormones, your body does a very good job at keeping your blood glucose levels within a tight range. But there are times when it can spike a little bit higher than normally, or it might drop a little bit lower than normally, which kind of makes sense because our body didn't exactly evolve to process, for instance, the amount of sugar that you can get from a bag of candy. And this is the crux of this CGM debate. Supporters of CGMs for healthy people argue that going above or below certain thresholds is harmful for your health. And that even if you stay within those thresholds, if you have a lot of variability, so your glucose is going up and down a lot, that's also harmful for you.
Glucose spikes on a daily basis are harmful to the cells in your blood vessels.
And the critics counter by saying that these brief glucose spikes that are seen in healthy individuals are not actually something we should be concerned about, and that using a CGM might just create unnecessary anxiety.
Changes of glucose over the course of the day are completely normal and completely healthy.
Since when is it a desirable thing to have a flat glucose? We don't even know that this is the case. It's never been the case. So why would you worry about it?
So which one is it? The obvious issue is the cost. One of these bad boys costs about 100 euros, and it lasts about 14 days on your arm, so you'll be paying about 200 euros per month. And there's a lot you can do for your health with that kind of money. Then there are the technical issues. Especially if you do high impact sports or water sports, the CGM might dislodge every now and then. And if it dislodges, then there's no way to insert it back. So that's just lost money.
Like, it actually happened just a couple days ago. I was at a friend's house. I was rushing. The hallways were thin. I rubbed my arm against the door. Even though I had clothes on, I had the active cover on, and it dislodged it. So I had to take it out. And there are times where, I've been in the sauna or I've been swimming, and maybe I pushed off the wall too hard when I'm swimming, and it's kind of dislodged it that way too.
In my personal experience though, I've never dislodged one of these sensors, but I have experienced the sensor just dying without any apparent reason. It's only like day 4. How about accuracy then? Are these things accurate? For instance, Dexcom markets its Stello sensor as the most accurate biosensor available without a prescription, and that's probably disputable. But let's just assume that this sensor represents the top sensors out there. With this sensor, 93% of the values from the sensor are within 20 milligrams per deciliter, or within 20% of the actual value, which apparently is even like very good accuracy for this type of a device.
But in large extent, if you look at 255 measurements in one day, or even 1,000 measurements in one day, if it measures minute by minute, most of those values are accurate. So they are accurate. I don't think there's any discussion about that anymore that needs to be made.
But where the accuracy still seems to fall short is during exercise. For instance, take a look at this graph. So this is 3 days of data from a person with type 1 diabetes, and they compared the values from a CGM, which is this black line, to the actual values from blood glucose, which are shown with these black dots. On day 1 and day 3, they didn't do any exercise, and you can see that the black dots correspond with the CGM values extremely well. But on day 2, they did an intensive mountain bike ride. The values from the CGM just get out of whack. Like, their blood glucose at some point was over 230 milligrams per deciliter, but the CGM was showing values below 140. So like half the actual value. This inaccuracy is largely explained by how the CGM measures or estimates your blood glucose. CGMs don't actually measure glucose from your blood. They measure it from the interstitial fluid, which is like the fluid surrounding your cells. It takes about 5 to 15 minutes, sometimes even longer, for the glucose to travel from your blood to the interstitial fluid. So the values from your CGM actually have a lag of about 5 to 15 minutes. And this doesn't really matter if you're just using the data retrospectively to see, let's say, whether some food spiked your glucose. But it does matter if you're on a run and you're looking at the values from the CGM to try and figure out whether or not you should take a gel to prevent bunking. In my own experience, a lot can happen to your glucose in 15 minutes. Even if your CGM shows that your glucose is 100 milligrams per deciliter and it's trending flat, in reality it could already be closer to 70 milligrams per deciliter and on a steep decline, in which case it might already be too late to take that energy gel. Or your glucose might be at 130 milligrams per deciliter, in which case it doesn't really make sense to take the energy gel because you would just be upsetting your stomach for no good reason. This is kind of a big deal because most of the CGMs marketed to athletes lead with the promise that they can optimize your nutrition during workouts and prevent you from bunking. But it seems that CGMs might be suitable for retrospective analysis, so looking at the data after your workout and trying to see if there's something you could try and optimize in the future. But you might not be able to prevent a glucose drop during workout by looking at the data. The next question is, once we have the data from the sensor, can we make sense of it? Can we use it to make better decisions in the future?
There's just so many more factors that impact glucose, that if I do like a banana test today and then a banana test tomorrow, just depending on how I slept or if I exercised that morning or not, like I might get different results. And then it's like, can you trust that experiment? I don't know.
For some, alcohol might increase glucose levels, and for some, alcohol might reduce glucose levels. Others have no effect from caffeine, but for some, it might increase blood glucose. And oh, don't forget that if you didn't get good sleep, you're stressed, or you're getting ill, or you just got a sunburn, your glucose might be elevated to the reasons that are not related to the food you're eating.
I think there could be 50 factors, and some factors haven't even been discovered yet. So it's a fascinating area of research, and dozens of factors.
And even if you eat the same meal twice, your glucose response is probably going to be different. I even found this one study where the glucose response to 2 identical meals varied the same amount as it did for 2 completely different meals. But even though there are many factors affecting your blood glucose, it's still true that the amount of carbohydrates and the quality of carbohydrates are the main factors that drive your glucose response. Like, no matter what, if you eat a bowl of white rice, your glucose will most certainly spike. That was a bit too much food. Yep, it's at 179 now. So it's not like we can't use CGMs to spot the specific foods that spike your glucose, but it would be very hard to know whether it was the ketchup in your food or last night's bad sleep that led to an abnormally high glucose response. Now, let's say that after multiple experiments, you find out that indeed your morning porridge spikes your glucose. To assess whether this spike is harmful or not, we would need to know the ideal range for your glucose levels. Like, what are the upper and lower limits that your glucose shouldn't go above or below? The CGM maps do show a range, often between 70 and 140 milligrams per deciliter. But what is that range actually based on? First of all, the 140 milligrams per deciliter threshold is probably from the oral glucose tolerance test, which is a test used in diabetes management and a test used to check whether you might be diabetic. In the test, you first fast overnight, which I've also done, and then you're given 75 grams of pure glucose. One of these tablets has about 2.1 grams of glucose, so I'm gonna need about 35 tablets, which is all of these. Cheers. Oh. Oh. And now we need to wait for 2 hours. So after 2 hours, my glucose level is at 75 milligrams per deciliter. If it was above 140 milligrams per deciliter, I would be considered pre-diabetic in this oral glucose tolerance test. And that's probably where the threshold of 140 milligrams per deciliter comes from. It's a cutoff for being pre-diabetic in the oral glucose tolerance test. But there isn't really any conclusive evidence that would suggest that briefly going above this 140 milligram per deciliter threshold would be detrimental to your health. And the low threshold of 70 milligrams per deciliter is also more of a guideline for when symptoms of low blood glucose might start to appear. I was feeling a bit lightheaded, a bit lethargic. I checked the app and my glucose is 59. Good to know that my feelings correlate with the data. But even that is not a strict boundary, because there are people who have no symptoms at levels as low as 55 milligrams per deciliter. So, no wonder that a research review concluded that these thresholds are not validated in healthy populations and that they are unlikely to represent risk thresholds. Another metric you get from these CGM apps is your glucose variability.
In people with diabetes, oscillations are a bad thing. But when people who don't have diabetes wear their CGM, they'll see these little oscillations, but that's because they're zooming in on a scale that is actually fairly tight. Are these oscillations also detrimental? That is up for debate.
One paper that is often cited as proof that glucose variability matters is this one.
These studies show us that managing our glucose levels is key to help us have a healthy heart and healthy blood vessels.
The researchers compare whether having your glucose vary between a low and a high is worse than having it constantly elevated. And the researchers concluded that indeed, varying your glucose is more harmful than keeping it constant. But the harmful effects of variability were not due to some brief glucose spikes above 140 milligrams per deciliter. Not even close. They compared having your glucose at a constant glucose level at 180 milligrams per deciliter and 270 milligrams per deciliter for 24 hours to glucose levels that oscillated between 90 and 270 milligrams per deciliter in 6-hour cycles over a 24-hour period. And this isn't the type of variability a healthy individual will ever experience. And it seems like a really big stretch to use this study to encourage healthy people to lower their glucose variability. And then we also need to ask whether CGMs create too narrow of a view on nutrition. The thing is that if you just focus on blunting your glucose spikes, there are many unhealthy ways to do it. An obvious way is to replace most of your carbs with fats. However, eating bacon all day long is most definitely a net negative for your health. And even though reducing simple carbs and refined sugars from your diet can be a positive thing, removing complex carbs and natural sugars for fear of introducing glucose spikes certainly is not a positive thing. And also, high intensity exercise usually increases your glucose levels. So should we just avoid high intensity exercise to improve glucose stability?
My legs are not moving.
Furthermore, and this is kind of like the core problem with this glucose-centric view of nutrition, researchers are still not 100% sure whether glucose spikes are the cause or symptom of a metabolic dysfunction. In other words, is it the glucose spikes that cause diabetes, or are the glucose spikes just a symptom of some other underlying dysfunction that creates both the glucose spikes and leads to diabetes? For instance, one view is that type 2 diabetes could actually develop due to dysfunctions in your lipid or fat metabolism, meaning that type 2 diabetes could in fact be caused by fat and not glucose. Well, in that case, focusing on reducing glucose might not help. In fact, it might make the situation worse if you're replacing most of that glucose with fat, which is where the problem could originate from. I've used these sensors for about 2 months in total, and I can say that they create a strong Hawthorne effect, which means that simply wearing the sensor makes you more aware of your behavior, which then can change your behavior. Do you feel like you think more about what you eat when you're wearing the sensor?
I do a little bit. If I know that the app's gonna like send me a notification in 2 hours, be like, you just got a glucose spike, then I'm a little bit more mindful that, hey, maybe I shouldn't eat this, or I know I should walk right after this. So I think that it keeps me in check a little bit.
And because the Hawthorne effect is so strong with these sensors, they could be a good tool for nutritional interventions. And this is kind of the complete inverse of what the companies are marketing these CGMs for. You know, instead of randomly buying one of these sensors to see if there is a need to change something, you would first identify a need with a professional and then use the CGM to help you make that change. And for an intervention like that, you would probably only need to use the CGM for a month or two to make the change permanent, and that would bring down the costs as well. And then finally, there are some potential uses in sports and for athletes. For instance, there has been some promising research on using CGMs to detect low energy availability, which is a hot topic at least in the endurance sports world at the moment.
There's certainly a possibility that a lot of my problems have been due to underfueling. Those could be a symptom, actually, of energy deficiency.
Basically, they have found that low nighttime glucose levels from a CGM might indicate low energy availability. And simply tracking your nighttime glucose with a CGM is much easier than meticulously tracking your calorie intake and expenditure for multiple days. And I've also heard athletes using CGMs to diagnose reactive hypoglycemia or reactive hypo. Reactive hypo basically means that your glucose levels drop very low at the start of exercise, often because you've taken a high carb snack within about 30 minutes of starting exercise. And I've also sometimes experienced these drops of glucose at the start of exercise, and I've been wondering like what the hell is going on.
Holy crap! So it's 78. That is a very, very steep spike. 75. Oh my god. Look at that.
All in all, it's hard to justify paying 200 euros per month for a sensor when the data that it gives us is still quite poorly understood, especially when most of the things that improve your glucose control or glucose stability are already well known. You don't really need a minute-by-minute glucose graph to know that those habits work. That said, I think CGMs do hold some promise, and they have some potential uses in the future. But for now, without clear guidelines or well-validated apps to interpret the data, these sensors probably do more to confuse than to clarify, especially when we're already flooded with data and metrics from a dozen other wearables.